Hello everyone, my name is Antonio Sandu and I'm PhD professor, head of Department of Law and Public Administration from Stefan cel Mare University of Suceava, Romania, and director of Lumen Research Center in Social and Humanistic Sciences from Iasi, Romania. And this paper, entitled Bioethical Acceptability of Euthanasia in the Greek Orthodox religious context, was written together with my colleagues, PhD researcher FRUNZÄ from Lumen Research Center in Social and Humanistic Sciences and PhD student Alexandra HUIDU from Sociological School of University of Oradea from Romania, and also from Lumen Research Center in Social and Humanistic Sciences. This paper is part of the activity of the Applied Ethics and Philosophical Practice Circle within the Applied Ethics Center of Stefan cel Mare University from Suceava, Romania, together with Lumen Research Center in Social and Humanistic Sciences, with the support of the Faculty of Law and Public Administration from Suceava University and Lumen Publishing House from Iasi, Romania. It is a great honor for us to be here with you at the World Congress of Bioethics, and we kindly thank the organizers of this Congress for this wonderful opportunity. Abstract of the paper. Background. Religious affiliation influences decisions about the ethical acceptance of euthanasia. The Greek Orthodox Christian Church expressly opposes the approval of euthanasia. Therefore, believers strongly oppose to this practice. Objective. The paper analyzes the instances of social construction of acceptability of euthanasia in the Greek Orthodox Christian religious context. Methods. A series of 3 focus groups and 10 individual interviews were undertaken with people belonging to the Greek Orthodox Christian religions in northeastern Romania. The interviews address how people make their decisions about the ethical acceptability of euthanasia and how religious beliefs inspired by Orthodox Christians are reflected in the decision-making process regarding the acceptability or unacceptability of an extreme medical practice, including interrupting the course of life at the patient's request. The focus group later watched an artistical movie with a strong emotional impact, which presented the opinion of a person with an unbearable medical condition who decides to resort to euthanasia. The reaction of the participants was observed, and the elements of acceptability or unacceptability of euthanasia, as well as the ethical religious background of the decision, were questioned again. Data analysis was performed using the grounded theory method. Findings. The emotional factor and discursive contingency of the reference group significantly contribute to nuancing religious beliefs. Conclusions. The bioethical discourse on euthanasia should be overturned to take into account not only religious beliefs, but also the emotional context in which the acceptability of an extreme medical practice is socially constructed. Today's society has surpassed the stage of militant secularism, noting its failure, at least in terms of the complete separation of secular institutions from religious organization, and placement of religious beliefs exclusively in the sphere of individual privacy and family life. The transition to a post-secular society brings a number of major changes in the perception of social acceptance of various practices, including those of an extreme medical nature, such as euthanasia, by recognizing the role of religious identity in the social construction of the idea of ethical acceptability. Religious affiliation influences decisions about the ethical acceptance of euthanasia. The Greek Orthodox Christian Church expressly opposes to approval of euthanasia, so it is expected that believers should strongly oppose to this practice. The present paper aims to analyze the instances of social construction of acceptability of euthanasia in the Greek Orthodox Christian religious context, especially in the northern eastern region of Romania. The social construction of ethical acceptability. The ontological and epistemic framework of this research is social constructionism, a theory on the processes of how individuals come to describe, explain, and take notes on the world they live in, and that includes them. Constructs represent operational definition applied to conceptualized aspects of reality. Among them, we include the idea of acceptability. In fact, any conceptualized idea that may suffer from an interpretative adrift, that is, to change its meaning by using it in a different interpretative communities, is a social construct. In social sciences, we speak of relativism of moral values, of a contextual dependence of constructs, of an interpretative adrift of concepts, and of a deconstruction of the legitimate meta-stories of modernity. We propose a transdisciplinary bioethical approach that recognizes a postmodern philosophical constitutive elements inculcated in a scientific social constructionist approach that favors the analysis of the discourse of various communicative actors and analyzes the interpretative adrift of the concepts of traditional bioethics, which should place in the social and bioethical acceptability of a phenomena at the center of the ethical model. In narrative constructionist sociology, the emphasis is placed on the construction of social stories, namely metanarratives, that generate local culture and strongly influence the individual, thus becoming a starting point for the individual to build his discourse and substantiate his own decisions. The meanings that individuals attribute to the world in which they live differ from one social actor to another, depending on the interpretative context in which social actors find themselves. In fact, their reality undergoes a process of deconstruction and reconstruction depending on the influences that the interpretative communities expect on the individuals. Individuals assume their own version of social reality in the processes of continuous interpretation. In social constructionism, the emphasis is on the process of creating meanings and less on the creating meanings themselves, because these meanings can change in the process of the interpretative adrift. From a social ontological point of view, social constructionism pleads for avoiding the idea of a social objective reality, but this does not include the existence of a social reality that subjects perceive as an objective and compelling, but this is only the result of a set of communicative actions that have generated an interpretative consensus. Starting from ontological theories regarding the existence of different levels of reality, Antonio Sandu built his own model of social constructionism, which he called fractal constructionism. Any phenomena can be understood through a process of sensitivations that helps individuals attribute meanings to the phenomena, resulting in a negotiation of the interpretation arising within their own interpretative communities. These meanings generate a series of ethical values that require the emergence of norms and establishing various sociological institutions. In order to understand a social phenomenon, we must first identify the norms and behaviors that reflect how interpretative communities, when faced with a window of ethical acceptability, put into practice a set of values that were considered necessary. The establishment of those values required the establishment of appropriate institutions. Those values have been called constitutive values. Once a series of constitutive values obtain the consensus of an interpretative community, they generate, through institutionalizations, a social level of social reality. For the institutions that act within the respective level of reality, a series of other values emerge as important and concrete guiding rules for accomplish the social practice of constitutive value. We call those values operational, but their emerge generates an interpretative adrift from the discursive focus on constitutive values to operational values. The achievement of operational values, in return, requires a new social construction through new normative institutions and a new interpretative consensus of these operational values, which become constitutive for the new institutions, thus generating a secondary level of social reality. From another perspective, which emphasizes the sacredness of a life as a spiritual originated value, which asserts itself in a post-secular and at the same time post-religious interpretative context, expressive autonomy must be limited to the point where it contradicts the sacredness of life. From that point forward, euthanasia becomes ethically unacceptable. This conflict of values occurs only on the intersection of two interpretative models, when one interpretation or the other is placed in a window of opportunity, the overtone window, determining the transition from completely unacceptable through successive interpretative adrift to acceptable from an ethical point of view, or vice versa, from socially acceptable to socially undesirable. The sacredness of life from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Christian bioethics speaks of the sacredness of human life, of the fact that any human being, whether born or not, is sacred because of the presence of the divine within. From this perspective, ethical issue can only be solved by taking into account the sacredness of life, and, as such, none of the practice that breach this sacredness can be accepted. Euthanasia falls between those practices precisely because it limits the natural course of life, interrupting it before its natural end. From an Orthodox Christian perspective, any ethical practice and any decision made by a person who adheres to Christian bioethics should be directed towards bettering himself through the loving approach of the other, through the act of care. Christian bioethics is different from secular bioethics, not in the sense of a difference in the professional standards, but in the sense of a total involvement of the Christian therapist in the act of care. Professional detachment should not be excluded, because of professional practice cannot be true outside the specific competencies of a profession, but the compassion is added to it as a form of spiritual encounter with the other, namely with the divine dwelling within the person who is needed of care. A series of elements related to respecting the sacredness of life should be added to the fundamental values of the medical profession: the spiritual value of providing help and the spiritual value of loving with your neighbor. These additional values should make the distinction between a practice infused with Christian values and a secular professional practice. The restriction of life before the end of its natural course contradicts the sacrificial approach by martyrdom. According to Christian beliefs, martyrdom is sanctified when it represents a continuance of life alongside God, but not as an exit from suffering through the back door, as in the case of euthanasia. Euthanasia is criticized from a Christian perspective in the sense that the person should accept their condition of health, among other things, because it is allowed by God. Suffering is seen as a trial that one has to face and that is useful for one's spiritual growth. The contemporary postmodern society is one that escapes pain, but also the assumptions of responsibility. These refer to a minimalistic ethic and ethics of twilight of duty, as Lipovetsky says, a society where people are rather selfish and individualistic. Ethical context of post-secular values in northeast region of Romania. The failure of the total separation between state and religions becomes obviously, especially when analyzed mentalities, a level where ethical values originate in faith, although secular at this point, are visibly influencing the ethical conduct of individuals. Thus, a series of fundamental Christian values are apparent at an ethical value such as human dignity, love, understanding, dialogue, and mutual respect. A perspective stemming from a sociology of religion is that today we are at the point of overcoming secular modernity and individualistic postmodernity, and we are moving toward a post-secular society. The idea of post-secular society appears as a recognition of the role that religious community have socially in the sense of mobilizing energy toward implementing ethical values. Such values have a Christian origin, even if they have suffered an interpretative adrift in the sense of secularization. Religious ethical values recovered in post-secular society could infuse various practices, at least at the level of their social acceptability component. Previous research shows that the northeast of Romania, the area where this research was conducted, could represent a model of post-secular society in which religious values are received by individuals through cultural filters. The cited study draws attention to the fact that the family remains the main source of information on ethical values, as well as the church. As such, we speak of a type of ethics originating in faith. Approaches to euthanasia in the post-secular society. A limited number of studies address the issue of euthanasia from a Christian Orthodox perspective. They are generally quantitative studies based on questionnaires, surveys. A study who questions Georgian Orthodox priests about euthanasia and its Christian Orthodox acceptability shows that 81% of respondents knew the meaning of the term euthanasia, which they consider to be the consent of life termination during illness when there is no way out and recovery is impossible, or a terminally ill person voluntarily decides to end life painlessly. The priest who participated in the survey said that the Orthodox Church bans euthanasia, but 39 of them believe that euthanasia can be justified in extreme medical conditions. The article also discussed the difference between voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, both of which are considered killing, although in some cases we can speak of mercy killing. The article emphasizes the difference between active and passive euthanasia, showing that the latter, which means disconnecting a patient from a life support devices, is considered less appealing from an Orthodox perspective. Regarding the social construction of acceptability of medical practice, the post-secular society is divergent, accepting that the religious factor may be one of the instances of social construction of ethical acceptability, but also considering that the interpretative adrift of ethical values may place a practice such as euthanasia in an area of acceptability when other secular constructive instances such as legal acceptance, level of knowledge and understanding of the practice may influence the social construction of euthanasia in post-religious context. Research methodology and data collection. A series of 3 focus groups and 10 individuals interviews were applied to individuals with Christian Orthodox beliefs in northeastern Romania. The interviews address how people make decisions about the ethical acceptability of euthanasia and how Christian Orthodox inspired religious beliefs are reflected in the decision-making process about the acceptability or unacceptability of an extreme medical practice, including the interruption of life at the patient's request. Data analysis. Data analysis was performed through the grounded theory method, which presupposes that participants in the process of social construction are brought together in various interpretative contexts called instances of social construction. Grounded theory is based on a progress identification of the semantic categories generated from the direct analysis of discourses obtained in our study through interviews and focus groups, and their aggregation into a theory. The purpose of grounded theory is to generate a theory on the studied social phenomena and not to verify the existence theory or hypothesis. Grounded theory is a method that is generally used in exploratory research of social phenomena that are not explained satisfactorily by a previous theory for studying completely new social phenomena, or when it is assumed that the explored phenomena is so different from previous social phenomena, even smilingly similar, that one can no longer apply existing theory. In this situation, the construction of a new theory is pursued, starting inductively from the data obtained in the field. Inductive category. Category 1. Meaning of the term euthanasia. Unfortunately, we have few definitions of this term that can be deduced from the focus groups or operational definition of euthanasia. This indicates that there was no ethical reflection among participants regarding euthanasia prior to the results from participation in this focus group. The lack of ethical reflection leads us to conclude that the topic of euthanasia has not yet been emphasized enough on the public agenda. Therefore, individuals, including those who participate in those focus groups, haven't previously analyzed and haven't formed an opinion on this medical practice. Thus, the participants in the focus groups have a superficial knowledge on the meaning of the term, but without any indication of awareness leading to critical positions from an ethical perspective in terms of its social acceptability. The fact that euthanasia, which is banned in Romania, although it is legalized in other European countries, is not on the public agenda in Romania, allows us to consider that this omission can be correlated with the influence of faith-originated values, which are currently part of common morality nationwide for the entire population. In the process of secularization, the value of human life transforms from an ontological values into a legal value, secular in nature, and the value of human dignity shifts from individual dignity to the dignity of the human species. We believe that the absence of euthanasia from the public agenda in the northeast region of Romania can be extrapolated to the whole country, and we consider that as an indicator for a taken for granted attitude that euthanasia is unacceptable in a secular Romania, a country that, at the same time, is still deeply influenced by religion. Category 2. Euthanasia as an alternative. The focus groups participants believe that euthanasia can be acceptable in the last days of life, when death is imminent and when a person is suffering from excruciating pain which can no longer be alleviated with painkillers. The relative acceptability of euthanasia is influenced by compassion for persons who are suffering, especially when euthanasia would mean a dignified end for them, relieving them of suffering when they are in a state when their expressive autonomy is almost non-existent. As such, the relative congruence of responses provided by the focus group's participants and the existing argument in the literature in favor of euthanasia might highlight the influence of the general culture context on the given local one and on the religious beliefs of the interviews. Category 3. Involvement of physicians in euthanasia. Much emphasis is placed on the involvement of physicians in euthanasia. The participants have divided opinion, the general emphasis being that doctors should not participate in such practice because they have taken a Hippocratic oath which should cause them to be in favor of life and not be part to extinguish life. On the other hand, emphasis is also placed on the need for specialized clinic where euthanasia could be legally performed and on the fact that there should be qualified medical staff to perform such practice. The need for caution in terms of specific training of medical personnel performing euthanasia of participating in such interventions is obviously to the respondents who underline the importance of psychological training for those professionals, which should be somewhat similar to that of the military personnel deployed in war missions. The focus group's participants believes that taking the lives of people repeatedly, even at their own request, or assisting them in the act of ending their own life can in some cases be a sign of imbalance of their mental illness. It can be concluded that in a society where euthanasia would be very easily allowed, an interpretative adrift might occur on a social level from the acceptability of euthanasia to the acceptability of eugenics, including euthanasia of people suffering from various disabilities with the purpose of selective eugenics. Category 4. Decisions on euthanasia. Most people believe that if euthanasia becomes legal, then the right to decide on it should belong exclusively to the person concerned. This right should be granted to the person only after consulting the doctor of a clinic that is exclusively specialized in euthanasia, confirming or refuting whether there is a medical course of action that can lead to improvement in this person's health condition, or if that person is indeed in a terminal situation. There should be an ethical, medical, and legal analysis. The delegate consent would be the equivalent of a killing agreement, which would be completely unethical, burdening all the people involved in the process of euthanasia with an unacceptable burden. In addition, the decision of the person who provides the delegate consent could be challenged any time and not necessarily only from a legal point of view. Legally, though, the act of the doctor performing euthanasia in unclear context could be labeled as manslaughter. The perspective for analyzing the possible decision to perform euthanasia was also secular in nature. The arguments of the interviews are similar to those discussed in the literature, which lead us to think that the opinion presented by the participants are rather culturally formed in involuntary interpretative adrift process, without a direct awareness of interest in euthanasia as a bioethical issue. The arguments were taken over from public debates and remain unfiltered by the participants' own opinions, where agree with these arguments without being able to argue why. Category 5. Legalization of euthanasia. Regarding the legalization of euthanasia, it is shown that this practice is legal in countries that have a democratic tradition, and consequently they would be able to set an example for Romania. It is interesting to note that cosmopolitan perspective on the legalization of euthanasia, seen in the context of alleged democratic deficit and less from the perspective of the local context, and on a social acceptance from the perspective of public ethics within the interpretative community, we are practically taking about a phenomena of anticipatory socialization. Category 6. Religious perspective on euthanasia. There is practically no concrete reference to the religious element other than that the Church considers suicide or murder to be a sin. We consider that the participants did not have previous moments of reflection on the possible religious and spiritual origin of their own conceptions regarding the partial acceptability or unacceptability of euthanasia. Many of the respondents seem to reject the religious idea that euthanasia is totally unacceptable. The idea of suffering as personal martyrdom as a specific religious argument was not discussed during the focus groups or interviews. Orthodoxy emphasized on suffering and its spiritual role, but we have not been able to identify references to this idea in focus groups or interviews, which may be a limitation of our research. The critique of acceptability of euthanasia from a religious perspective is rather a series of somewhat a priori ideas which are not the result of effective self-judgment, but rather previous ideas accumulated by the participant on which they did not intentionally reflect before participating in the research. This critique is aimed at the fact that there are people in terminal stages who are struggling to life, have hope until the last moment of life, and then, inspired by the example of these people, those who give up by resorting to euthanasia are to be blamed. But this argument is also rather a plea for a freedom to choose and fight for one's own life, even with euthanasia is a legal option, but not a moral or spiritual one. Category 7. Euthanasia and the problem of disconnecting the patient from life support devices. There is an overlap between euthanasia and disconnecting from artificial life support devices, and the arguments against euthanasia extend to the latter. The possibility of miraculous recovery of the person it is also discussed here, and even a series of hypothetical or real situations are presented in which a person has recovered from a long-term deep coma. If such, a person would have been euthanized, his or her right to life would have been violated. The confusion between active euthanasia and disconnecting from life support devices rise again as a passive form of euthanasia and an attitude against medical abstinency. The reference to possible miracles stems from folk religiosity, the need for the fabulous and the process of mitogenesis in terms of artificial life support techniques, which are deemed to be miraculous and already become a part of everyday mythology. The perspective is not necessarily a religious one in the dogmatic sense, and that is why we did not include it in the category regarding the role of religion in forming ethical acceptability, because it is rather related to the narrative construction of the medicalization of social life by including the phenomena of technological miracles. Category 8. Euthanasia of persons with impaired discernment. Most interviewed persons have questioned whether requests for euthanasia coming from people who are incompetent to decide about their own lives, either because of a lack of discernment or because of their medical conditions, should be accepted. One of the interviews tells us that, in general, people who resort to euthanasia are considered cowards. The possibility that those people are in the state of altered consciousness precisely due to the disease is also invoked, which involves a state of increased anxiety and disappointment. Category 9. The psychological perspective on people who want to perform euthanasia. We notice the centrality of the theme of the possible mental imbalance, both at the level of the person requesting euthanasia and of the one who is involved in performing it. We believe that such a perspective defines normality as the prohibition of euthanasia and request for this practice to be automatically marked as unnatural, even if socially acceptable, but questionable both morally and from the perspective of mental integrity of the person requesting or performing it. We consider that the reference to the sphere of psychological or psychiatric pathology for those who request or perform such practice originated in pre-religious morality, but it is expressed as in a post-secular society in which the transition from stigmatization of suicide to euthanasia was made. Category 10. Performing euthanasia as an act of killing. We see a predominance of faith-originated ethical values in terms of the ethical foundation of personality, given that participants in the focus groups consider it abnormal to contribute to the end of a person's life. Category 11. Difficult, limited access to euthanasia. Access to euthanasia should be particularly difficult and limited. This should not be an easy process in which a person can say, "I would like to die tomorrow," and in a few months the request will be approved and possibly implemented. But instead, there should be more filters, and the concrete application of euthanasia must be considered responsibly to determine whether or not it meets a number of criteria for the acceptability of such practice. Category 12. The burden of life. A very important element was brought into discussion, namely the burden of life. Of course, the acceptability of euthanasia also comes from the fact that sick people who are in an incurable state consider themselves a burden to others. In fact, suicide itself is often associated with the burden of life. The burden of life and caring for such a person with a severe mental disability, therefore, were discussed, as they can be a long-term burden for both the family caring of the person and for the person herself, if he or she is in pain, especially if there are also other severe chronic conditions that place the person in a state of permanent discomfort and pain. Category 13. The movie Me Before You. Watching the movie has caused a moment of reflection on the ethical acceptability of euthanasia among the participants in the focus groups, who empathetically place themselves in the situation of the two main characters of the movie. Generated theoretical model. Religious affiliation influences ethical decisions, including those regarding the acceptability or unacceptability of medical practice such as euthanasia. The Christian Orthodox Church expresses its disregardment with euthanasia, and therefore those who are faithful are expected to consistently opposed to such practice, because the individual was created in the image and likeness of God, and only the divine should intervene in the end of human life. The analysis of the focus groups and interviews showed that only a few participants placed the rejection of euthanasia in a religious context, a context which is only marginally considered and is not acknowledged as a source of for the participants' belief on the ethical acceptability of euthanasia. The rejection of euthanasia is rather placed in the context of concern for those individuals who might be subject to such practice, perhaps without their consent. This might happen in the terminal stage of a disease when the patient is no longer able to consent, terminal states being considered psychological situation that would diminish the individual's ability to consent. Other particular cases that were discussed refer to the euthanasia of people suffering from severe depression and the euthanasia of minors, which requires delegate consent. Regarding the ethical acceptance of euthanasia, this is influenced by the general cultural context on the given local context and less by the religious beliefs of the interviewees. The perspective of possible decision to perform euthanasia is secular in nature. Arguments regarding the possible legalization of euthanasia should take into account the level of ethical acceptability of such practices, including those related to the religious specificity of local interpretative communities. Some conclusion of the analysis. Contrary to expectations, the religious element was less present at the discursive level. It was rather present as a continuous substrate that unconsciously motivates the decision to reject legalizing euthanasia. The participants are rather inclined to accept it is a practice, however, after asserting strict limitations regarding the category of persons who could benefit from this practice or could be involved in performing euthanasia, so extremely strict conditions must be put into practice in order for euthanasia to be legal. Euthanasia should be totally forbidden to people without discernment or impaired discernment, because delegate consent regarding euthanasia is unacceptable. Even if participants are aware that from the point of view of the religions they adhere to, the practice is totally unacceptable, personally they would admit to cases of euthanasia when human dignity is subject to the ultimate test, namely if there is unbearable pain involved. Thank you very much for your attention. Please be with us on Zoom. There will be 2 meetings on the 21st of June at a time and the links you can see on the slide. Also, please see the brochure attached to this presentation, which contains the full text of this presentation as well as other related articles of the authors. We also invite you to visit the Lumen Publishing House's website at www.lumenpublishing.com, and we also kindly invite you to publish in our journals on bioethical topics. You can find Lumen's journals at www.lumenpublishing.com/journals. Thank you again and see you soon.